Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward, overheated, turbulent planet. This is Andy Revkin. This is like episode, I don't know, 550 or so of Sustain What, several of which have featured my guest today, Genevieve Guenther. Um, she's the founder of End Climate Silence, which I think is how most people would be familiar with her, but and a scholar who has turned her attention ferociously and with depth and determination to the question of climate language and how that plays in what we do and don't do about climate change, climate risk, and energy change, even more particularly for Genevieve. It's great to see you again. It's been a while. I know you're in book launch week mode. So
Yeah,
how's that feeling?
I feel it's all incredibly surreal. I feel like I haven't really slept in a week, and it's been
Right.
so wonderful to see everyone who's turned out and to get all the positive feedback on social media. But it's just this whirlwind, you know. And so you are actually my last interview for Pub Week. And it's a wonderful way. It's a wonderful culmination of what's been a great week. And then I'm going to take the weekend off.
That's a good
Feels
thing to do. Yeah.
Pardon? As I was telling you, our AC broke this morning. So thank God it's not 95 degrees in New York City as it was in the past couple of days, but it
Yeah.
is 82 degrees and I am very, very warm. So I feel acutely how people with greater vulnerability and exposure
Right.
experience the climate crisis all the time. Like just living in this kind of heat day after day after day after day is really very enervating.
Yeah, and we'll talk about how that relates to climate solutions. I've written a ton about the vulnerability.
We have.
I see a vulnerability emergency that hides behind all the rhetoric of climate emergency.
Yeah, totally.
When you really look at, it's there's some people out there who tweet and write, "We're all in this together now. It's clear," and I think that's bullshit, basically.
Well, I don't agree with you about that. I think that
We could talk about that. It's
we can talk
bullshit for
about
the
that.
time being. Um, but let's get into the book. And again, it's great to have you back on this journey,
Thank you
Sustain
for
What.
having me.
As I mentioned, I came to know you through End Climate Silence, as a lot of people in the media hopefully have gotten to know you,
Mhm.
because there is a weird media issue with climate change. As distinct from weather, which is in the news constantly,
Mhm.
and energy policy is in the news constantly. But
Mhm.
how do you feel that's been going before we get into the book? You're
Yeah.
there's like, just to give you a data point, when I got into this, well, 40 years ago, there were like three of us writing about global and climate change. And now there's hundreds, if not thousands. They just had the Covering Climate Now awards. And
Mhm.
so just numerically, it can feel like, oh, yay, hooray. But so tell me the but and the and.
So, I founded End Climate Silence in 2018, as you know, because it occurred to me once when I was listening to the radio that I had heard three different stories that were clearly climate stories on the news. Two were about extreme weather. One was about the difficulty of doing animal agriculture in a drought, which, is a climate story on a lot of different levels, right? But none of these stories that I heard actually mentioned the words climate change. And so I started looking around, and all of this energy reporting, all of this extreme weather reporting, a lot of the political stories I was reading were actually climate stories. And very often the journalist would describe, for example, if they were reporting on extreme weather, what the science said would be the connection between global heating and the intensification or exacerbation or the increased likelihood of an extreme weather event. But again, there was not the acknowledgement, the explicit acknowledgement that this was climate change.
Right.
It was climate silence. So I founded End Climate Silence not just to push for more climate change reporting, which I think we have now. Most major news outlets have climate desks with incredibly knowledgeable and talented journalists staffing those desks, writing really important and well told stories. But still, I think the general approach to climate in the news media especially in the broadcast news media, is that climate is a kind of niche story. It's a left political issue. And so if you're going to cover it, you're going to cover it as such. So,
or it's a science story.
right,
Many of
100%.
mine ended up in the science section of the New York Times.
That's right. So it's a science story. It's a, niche political issue. It's an environment story, but it's not actually something that's already emerging in, I would say the vast majority of reporting that circulates in the news. But in reality, it is already affecting most of the stories that reporters are telling about climate and energy, about inflation, about immigration, about political horse race contests, all of it. It's all intersecting with climate. So, there was definitely an upsurge of interest and attention after the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius. And, I wasn't the only one calling for greater news coverage. And Covering Climate Now was founded at the same time by Mark Hertsgaard, who is a longstanding and very accomplished climate journalist. And he's partnering in a very positive way with media outlets to try to help them tell the story better. But I was, essentially the bad cop in this space. So using the power of social media to call out people who were not fulfilling their journalistic responsibilities. And, that I think had some impact. But the group kind of disbanded over the course of the pandemic. One of our volunteers got sick, other volunteers moved, it just sort of, and the pressure for it seemed to ease off a bit because people did seem to be doing much better. And then, of course, I got deep into writing this book. And so my activism got sort of shunted. I mean, I think of the book as a form of activism, but this kind of explicit activism kind of got shunted to the side or put on a shelf. But, I was expecting climate coverage to bounce back after the pandemic, and it really didn't. So 2023 was the warmest year in recorded human history, but the coverage of the climate crisis actually went down. So on the agenda next is to revive end climate silence and start pushing in new ways for the media to tell this story, in all the stories they're already reporting.
Yeah, well, in some ways, the book is the flip side. It's the begin climate language, or the begin climate clarity.
Yeah.
Amid a fog of climate distortion, disinformation, confusion. And so I've got here the table of contents, which kind of breaks down your key themes. But I thought you could just sort of lay out, your ideal prod. What does this book represent? Why should people dig in, and who should dig in?
So this book was written, obviously for people in the climate movement, for climate journalists, for policymakers who are trying to pass climate policy. But really, this book was written for affluent urban Democrats who who know that climate change is real and who are concerned or even alarmed about it. Republicans too, because people don't realize this, but there are Republicans who are concerned and alarmed about climate change, especially the ones who are under 45. So really, it was written for all people who are concerned and alarmed about climate change, but who have this kind of confused understanding of both the problem and its resolution, because their ideas and the way they talk about climate change have been indelibly influenced by fossil fuel propaganda, which I show in the book, I hope, is not just sort of like, a series of lies that are getting lobbed from the far right. It's a kind of like status quo mainstream understanding of the climate crisis, which produces this false belief that we can still keep using coal, oil, and gas in very large amounts and still halt global heating anyway. So the book is designed to show the kind of intellectual, cultural, and political origins of that new form of climate denial, dismantle it, and offer new talking points and then new messages that will help keep the phase out of fossil fuels, the end of the use of coal, oil, and gas, at the forefront of the political conversation.
Right, and you start out with something that I've been thinking about for a very long time, the word "we." Uh,
Yeah.
I think the first time I wrote, "There is no we in energy and climate
Well, there you go. So
questions." It
you
was
were
it was
on board
it was a
before
decade ago, and
you.
and I've been, I have this watchwords series that I've been running on
Yeah,
my
I know. I love
sustainable
it.
thing, and "we" was the first one. So talk about that "we" and sort of the obscure what it obscures and what is illuminated when you dig deeper, like who is the "we," and on
Yeah,
both ends.
100%.
We need to and etcetera.
So the preface of the book is about this little pronoun, the word we. And, using the word we when we talk about climate change definitely makes sense because on a semantic level, it is true. We, humanity, we are causing the climate crisis. We need to draw our emissions down to net zero as soon as humanly possible, right? Um, but there's a universalism to the pronoun we, and also a personal implication that I am part of this we, you are part of this we, we're all part of this we. And that universal kind of responsibility for climate change is actually distorting and dangerous. Okay. The we that affords universal responsibility for global heating is giving the people who are doing everything they possibly can to keep fossil fuels in our systems political cover by suggesting that somehow we are all apportioned the same amount of responsibility, not only for causing the crisis, but for stopping it. But let's think about this. Does this we actually include half the population on this planet who live on less than $6.85 a day and emit no carbon at all, basically? Does it include everyone in the climate movement who's trying to reduce their own carbon footprint to some extent or another, but also like really push for the solutions, the systemic solutions that we need? Does it include our children who were born into this world and who aren't even like drawing down a salary yet, let alone making
Right,
choices about climate and energy? Of course not.
right.
So, what this we obscures is this continuum of responsibility. So, on one side, you have all the people that I listed who are almost entirely innocent. And then on the other side, you have the villains. And this is not just a trope. I think they are literally villains because these are people who are doing everything they can to sustain the fossil fuel system, despite the fact that global warming seems to be accelerating, just so they can continue to make profits for another decade or two, willing to heat up our planet on the trajectory we're on by 3 degrees Celsius by 2100, which would be totally catastrophic. And of course, the planet will just continue to heat up until we actually phase out fossil fuels and create a net zero economy. So, and then of course, in between these two extremes, there are like degrees of complicity, right? So in
Mhm.
the book, I call out, PR executives who help oil and gas companies create greenwashing
Right.
campaigns. I call out journalists who should know better, but who still perform climate silence in their reporting. So to me, that's an attempt to sort of make money off the crisis or despite the crisis. And that to me is, on the bad side of the continuum. But there are
Mhm.
degrees of complicity. But the point is that none of us should imagine ourselves as equally responsible for the crisis because that prevents us from putting our attention where it should be, which is on getting the people who are trying to sustain the fossil fuel system out of power and replacing them with leaders who can lead us into a sustainable future.
Yeah. But we'll get into this a bit more, I think, toward the end. But there's one thing that I think is pretty clear too, that fits within the framework you just laid out. It's that within the arena of oil and gas production, there are countries like Ghana and Madagascar that now have identified substantial deposits that can
Mhm.
help them energize their low carbon, super low carbon societies, and that fit even within Johann Rockström's planetary boundaries. He's made the point that there is carbon space, and that the part of this clarification of the we also is about what we, meaning rich developed countries, owe to. If we want to say no, you can't use your oil and gas, we have to give them something to fill that gap. And you get into that in the book.
There is no excuse for anyone in the global north, the United States, any country in the EU, the UK, to be continuing to expand fossil fuel extraction. I mean, from the very get-go in 1992, when the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was established, the basic framework for climate governance is that countries that have contributed the most carbon and have benefited the most from the fossil fuel economy have a responsibility to draw down their emissions, to phase out fossil fuels first, in order to leave as much carbon space as possible for people in the developing world to use fossil fuels to the extent they need to, in order to develop in a way which still could leapfrog fossil fuel infrastructure into something clean and sustainable. But that ability to leapfrog also relies on the global north fulfilling their responsibilities for global finance, which to date they have not done. And the credit capital is so expensive. So it's a whole sort of system of globalized injustice. But the problem is people have justified it to themselves by imagining that, wealth is going to shield them from the climate crisis. And, there's this great, I think it's Bertrand Russell, I might be getting this wrong, God help me, but there's this great philosophical parable about the turkey and the farmer. So every day the turkey greets the farmer at the barnyard door and gets grain from him. And so he thinks the farmer is this, really beneficent guy, right? And the day before Thanksgiving, when he gets this grain from the farmer, he still thinks the farmer's a beneficent guy, but then boom, on Thanksgiving, actually the farmer chops his head off. So we look at the way the world works now, and we see this sort of protective effect of wealth and infrastructure, but the belief that that's going to continue as the planet continues to leave this climate niche that, all of civilization was developed in is just, it's foolhardy, and it's not even coherent on a philosophical level.
Yeah. So basically the full design of the book rests on this idea of a network of climate discourse.
Correct.
And you've got the different parties who are maybe you could just walk through that a little bit. And you talk here about the importance of, this isn't just about what word you use in a sentence, it's, as Lakoff and others would describe. So what's the Venn diagram here?
Okay, so maybe by way of answering that question, I'll just explain how I came to write this book.
Yeah.
So I came to write this book having read a particular op-ed written for the New York Times, which was a very beautifully and elegantly written version of the sort of main disinformation tactic from fossil fuel interests, dating from about 2010 right up till around 2018, I would say, which was to claim that there was some uncertainty about the science, which made it foolhardy, or which prevented people from justifying the kinds of policy moves and expenditures we would need to make in order to get fossil fuels out of our system and change the economy. So the goal, as Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway and others have detailed, was to create doubt that climate change was real among the general public. So I'm reading this version of this argument, and a light bulb went off, because I realized why this was working. It's not just that there was disinformation coming from the right, and then the left and the climate scientists were trying to provide, thank you.
There he is.
I wasn't going to mention the name, but
he shut up, Harry Potter style. He
told it one kind of way. I just didn't want to, I didn't want to.
It's okay.
Awkward.
It's not awkward. It's important to be specific sometimes.
Okay. Yes. So
it spurred you powerfully.
Oh, that's brilliant. Okay. Yes. That was the op-ed. That's where I got the idea for this book, because what I realized that Stevens and all of his right-wing brethren had done was they had circulated this word uncertainty by appropriating it from climate science, right? And then weaponizing it by putting it into the discourse in a different way. So there's this weird sort of ambiguity to the word. So most of us who are not scientists think the word uncertainty means like the state of not really knowing or the state of not being sure, right?
Right.
What do you want for dinner? I don't know. I'm uncertain. Maybe Mexican, maybe Chinese. Who knows? I don't know. But in climate science itself, uncertainty doesn't mean that. It means the range of possible outcomes that can be predicted with confidence. So you can actually use uncertainty and confidence synonymously when
Right.
you're talking about climate models. You can talk about the sort of uncertainty interval of a model, or you can talk about the confidence interval of a model. So it's all the things you can predict with confidence from best to worst case outcomes. But the right wing wasn't talking about uncertainty that way. And they weren't like they were drawing on this kind of colloquial use of the word. And what was so diabolical about it was that then, because this had been sort of seeded in the public discourse, then anytime a climate scientist talked about the uncertainty of their research, they would unwittingly kind of reinforce this message, give it air, give it water, nurture this message that somehow there was this belief among scientists that climate change, they weren't sure whether climate change was real or not.
Right.
And once I saw that dynamic, then I started to see it everywhere. And I realized that the problem with fossil fuel propaganda is not just that it's like, one side is lying and the other side is trying to counter that with information. It's that they've polluted the public discourse to create this kind of echo chamber, which creates a kind of mainstream common sense belief that we can actually continue to use fossil fuels, but somehow still halt global heating anyway. Or, even if we don't halt global heating, it won't really matter because climate change won't be that bad.
Yeah, you get into that in the book and in a valuable way. What drove me crazy back in 2010, the IPCC hired publicists. They hired a marketing group to ask them about language as they were going toward that assessment of that coming year. And they were told avoid these words, avoid uncertainty, avoid risk. They say, these are words that mean something different to the public and to you. And to me, my God, that just feels like the worst possible thing. But I'm not a professional, high paid marketing consultant. I think what you're doing with the book, I think happily, is diving into the word and saying it's been appropriated, but here's a way to talk about it differently. I don't know if you had followed this would it have been a mistake for the IPCC? I mean, there's plenty of mentions of uncertainty in the IPCC reports, so it's not like they took this on.
Right.
And embraced it. But it just struck me as, oh my God, the worst possible option.
Why? Because why would that be bad?
The more scientists say, when I talk about uncertainty, I mean, it's a form of knowledge. It gives you an action space. Uncertainty, that's the other thing. This isn't just about, it's about that aspect as well, that uncertainty is bounded. Scientific uncertainty is a form of calculation that gives you a place in which you can act. It's not
right. No, 100%. And that's literally the space in which policy is made.
And by the way, Mario Molina, the late great Nobelist in chemistry, who was one of the ozone layer discoverers, used to use this slide, and he let me use it in my talks too. As I say, what you don't know, this is a tiger, right?
Right.
We don't have the whole picture, but boy.
Right. And, to that extent, uncertainty is actually, a danger sign. It's not something that you can, that gives you the license to exhale,
Oh, I like that. Yeah. Right? And actually your section of the book on, on cost, you get into cost and risk. And of course, those fat tails are a big part of why you act, not why you sit on your hands.
100%. But, I think you are selling yourself short as seeing that idea that you just articulated as sort of common sense. I think it's actually kind of a sophisticated idea that gets lost in political, communication, or even just sort of like science communication, because it does require a sort of understanding of statistics and probabilities and just, how projections are made, that I just don't think most Americans ever encounter, and certainly not in high school, and sometimes not even in college if they're humanists. So I don't know. I think you're underselling how the level of your understanding and overselling how easy it is to
I didn't say it's easy. I didn't say it's easy.
Really mean.
But using your methods, and you talk about the end, the conclusion of your book, you're talking about sustained conversation with your community, with your family, with your friends, and none of this is there's no aha moment here that you just, oh, now I understand uncertainty is dangerous. Now I'm going to make sure we electrify our school bus fleet of our school. I would like to think it's that simple. So, which is why people need to read books like this one to kind of dig in deeper. And so chapter 1, section 1 is all about alarmist. Just talk briefly about that, and then we'll work our way through. So just a couple minutes on each idea.
So let me just preface that by saying, essentially, like, each chapter is focuses on a single term, except for chapter 4, I think it is, which is the kind of compound term India and China, because these are the terms which I argue dominate the language of climate politics, because they're the terms that produce the following narrative, right? Yes, climate change is real, but to say that it's an existential threat is, quote, alarmist. And anyway, getting fossil fuels out of our system or even reducing emissions is going to cost too much. So the best thing we can do is focus on economic, quote, growth, because wealth is protective, and simply sort of, invest in, quote, innovation and resilience. And anyway, the West shouldn't act unilaterally on emissions or climate because, they're still burning coal in, quote, India and China. So
right. That's all a very soft and comforting blanket right there.
Right? I mean, we've all heard that narrative in fragments and echoes, and sometimes it's in entirety, like all the time. So, but this is what supports this new climate denial, this new form of climate denial, which says we can keep using fossil fuels but still halt global heating anyway, which is not true. We have to phase fossil fuels out. So the first chapter is about the term alarmist, right? And so what I try to do there is two things. I try to kind of give readers a taxonomy of the different kind of viewpoints in the climate movement, because it's not monolithic at all. It's not particularly unified. There is a diversity of political disposition and viewpoint and, solutionism or whatever. And then
it sounds like the Democratic Party.
Yeah, it's exactly like the Democratic Party, because, the Republicans can all work in lockstep. The Democrats have to have this gigantic tent, which, has to include, like, green entrepreneurs and, indigenous frontline activists. So how do you build that coalition? I try to take that on in the last chapter a little bit. But so the first chapter is about that taxonomy. And then the second chapter is to try to prove that the climate policy progress we've made so far has been achieved as a result of increasing the level of alarm in the general public and among policymakers. So, the background of that is that there's a debate among climate scientists whether, hope or fear is more efficacious, and, like, how much you should talk about technological optimism, et cetera, et cetera. And many scientists have been arguing that you shouldn't try to scare people because it shuts them down. And what I try to show in the book is that historically, any progress that we've made on climate has come because people have this kind of oh shit moment where they realize they have to do something or else their own children are going to be in danger. So,
but how does that relate to current politics, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which, expressly, because of Manchin's insistence, didn't really mention climate, but...
Right. Well, I mean, so the narrative I tell in the book essentially is that this wave of alarm built up from, many different sources. One of them was David Wallace Wells's The Uninhabitable Earth. Mm-hmm. The other one was the release of the special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius in 2018 by the IPCC, which not only made it clear that even warming between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius would be catastrophic for, billions of people and extremely dangerous and, risk setting off tipping points, but also that to have even a 50-50 chance of halting warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we would have to basically zero out emissions in decades. And I don't think really anybody realized that time was that short. And it was even shorter than that because, of course, most of the models of mitigation pathways that ended up in that report were already modeling overshoot scenarios where somehow the planet heats up over 1.5 degrees Celsius, and then through some sort of technological mumbo jumbo, we managed to pull enough carbon out of the atmosphere that we cool the planet back down. I take on that idea in chapter 5 in innovation, but that's leaving it to the side. So we have David Wallace Wells, we have the SR 1.5 degree report, and then of course we have Greta Thunberg and the youth activists across the world who stood in front of policymakers and the global powerful and said, I'm panicking because this is my life we're talking about here. This is not about like future generations somewhere down the road. I am a child who is standing in front of you telling you that you are ruining my future. And so I think everyone sort of was taken aback by that, but also looked at the kids that they had in their own homes and thought, wow, well, this is my child too. So, and then the increase in news coverage, the efflorescence of climate Twitter, which was really one of the most amazing intellectual communities I've ever been a part of, which was basically destroyed after Elon Musk took over Twitter.
I would argue it's still there. You just have to dive beneath the polluted surface that he created.
No, it's true. But I think more than half the people that I follow.
Oops.
I feel that a lot of the people who were contributing to the conversation have left, and it's very sad. I don't really care if lots stick to my texts, tweets, but like, it's just the loss of community.
Oh, I concur. It's, to have to put on toxic suit and a diving mask in order to find the value of a communication portal is not ideal.
Right.
You do mention in this chapter, before we move on, you're talking about a pretty fine dance between the reality of the monumental changes we're wreaking on the planet's systems, and not talking about the extinction crisis part as much as about how the real-time effect on people's lives today. That I have a section there. So that does feel it's, we're in an environment where, Michael Mann spends half of his time fighting overstatement,
right,
and half of his time, it's probably more than half of his time now, realistically, fighting people who have locked in on a truly what I see as unproductive framing. So how do you navigate that line?
Well, so I feel for climate scientists, first of all. I mean, they have to protect their own authority as people who speak accurately and who are not associated with the more like unhinged factions of the climate movement. So, and I think that especially, Mike believes firmly that if you exaggerate and think the problem is worse than it is, it's going to shut you down. So in the book, I also talk about 3 different kinds of doomism. And certainly one of the forms of doomism that we need to combat is a doomism that says now it's too late to halt global heating. The planet is already spinning out of our control. And, I don't know why people say this, but there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the science says, which says if we achieve net zero emissions, we can still halt global heating, and heating will actually like equalize within 3 to 5 years. So, I understand why that is such a focus of so much science communication. But from my perspective, I think it's very important to be able to talk about the climate crisis using the techniques of literary representation and of rhetoric, right? So you should be allowed to use hyperbole, like when Antonio Guterres said that the era of global warming has ended and the era of global boiling has arrived.
Right.
I thought that was really evocative and really powerful, especially for someone who lives in a really humid city like New York City. Like, it does feel like we're kind of boiling ourselves. And it also sort of implicitly connects to that metaphor of the frog in the pot, where you're slowly boiling yourself. I thought it was a piece of brilliant speech making.
And
And
he's also gone straight at the fossil fuel
I
industry.
mean, he's amazing. He's one of the greatest climate advocates we have on the whole planet. And so I just admire him so profoundly. He's gone after the fossil fuel companies. He's gone after the PR companies. He's asked
Mhm.
news media outlets to stop taking fossil fuel ad money. He's outlined a faster timeline for global north decarbonization than even the IPCC itself. But what's so interesting about his trajectory, just as a sort of like sideline, and I talk about this in the book a little bit, but I want to bring it up here, is that in 2017, before the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, in 2017, he was a kind of like centrist techno optimist who had the theory of change in his head that we could partner with oil and gas companies because they were going to deliver the sort of like clean energy technologies that would be, the innovations of the future, and that they were going to like transform themselves into, carbon management companies and like,
Right.
providers of solar panels. And he was like trying to get lots of private investment into the space. And I don't know, I mean, I've never met the man. I don't know what happened. I'm assuming the 1.5 degree report had something to do with it. But between 2017 and 2019, when I started tracking his rhetoric, he was radicalized.
Yeah.
This is not something he was saying even just, 5 years ago, or I guess, oh my God, it's almost 8 years ago now.
Yeah. Some of it's probably being well into his term. He probably felt more like a
Totally,
second term president. You can just do what you want. Going
totally,
back to his roots in Portugal.
totally.
So you do have a big section on growth, a lot on economics and
Yeah,
on Solo and Nordhaus, et cetera. But to
yeah,
cut to the chase, what's the key? You do also take on the idea of decoupling as a real way of looking at how we should see our relationship with the rest of the world, whether
yeah,
you setting aside the idea of nature being this line between us and nature.
right.
So what's the and how do you talk about, as you say, how do you talk about economic growth?
Well, I mean, I think probably the most dangerous myth out of all of the myths that I cover in the book, the most dangerous myth is the one that says our wealth is going to shield us from climate devastation. That to me is the most dangerous myth. And you even see it in
Mhm.
people on the left, progressives, who who lament the profound global injustice of the climate crisis. I mean, in some sense, this is like the greatest, just in terms of scale, at least, one of the greatest, if not the greatest injustice in human history that you could possibly imagine, that like a small part of the population gets to destroy the planet and make it uninhabitable just to continue its own basically unnecessary lifestyle.
Mhm.
So, progressives see this and decry it, but they also assume that, oh, we in the global north, we in America, affluent people, billionaires are going to be okay. Like even at the end of Don't Look Up, Adam McKay has, as a kind of like, end credits scene, the billionaires fly off to colonize a different planet where, deliciously they're eaten by like extraterrestrial birds. But still, there's this myth that if you're wealthy enough, you can somehow leave the only planet known to support life in this vast void of a universe and just, end up somewhere else like Mars or something. So I wanted to think about degrowth, but I realized that nobody's going to have a serious conversation about degrowth until this myth that wealth is protective is busted. So I was like, well, where does this myth come from? What is going on? Like, what
Mhm.
is the research? And I realized that this myth is based essentially on the work of one economist, Robert Solow, who created the kind of neoliberal or at least neoclassical theory of growth, which then over the course of the 20th century became a kind of story about the way the world actually works. But this story about the way that the world works is not based on any empirical evidence whatsoever. It's simply a story that kind of got more and more elaborate and more detailed, and more like, I don't know, vociferous in a way, as other economists took it up and started using it to describe what was happening over the 20th century. And, the reason it was so successful is that it did describe what happened over the 20th century. So, like, we were still using horses to pull our munitions in World War
Right.
II, right? Horses. And then, within a generation or a little bit more, we have space flight. So the level of innovation and technological change and economic growth that happened over the 20th century got taken as a kind of proof that what Solow said is actually true. But this is what he said. In 1956, he wrote this paper. He created a mathematical model and wrote a paper about it called A Contribution to a Theory of Economic Growth. And so in 19th century classical economics, what you had was basically three factors of production. You had labor, like the people who did the work. You had capital, the people who invested money in, infrastructure and companies and who paid the labor. But then you had the third factor of production in classical economics was land, like
Right.
the part of the planet that would grow food, that would feed both labor and capital. And so in classical economics, there was always kind of a ceiling to economic growth, because they were like, well, even if the economy grows and people get wealthier and then they have more children, or, things get bigger, at a certain point, we're not going to be able to just like keep growing more food. So the population's going to level off, and eventually the economy is going to sort of achieve a steady state. And Solow said, well, actually, we can get land out of the equation and substitute land as a factor of production with this other mathematical variable, which I am now going to call, quote, technological possibilities. And he made technological possibilities this function, like this mathematical function in his model, which made his model homologous to the first degree, which means that it modeled like a linear increase indefinitely. Because he said, okay, maybe we're going to, maybe there are these constraints, but there's always the technological possibility of overcoming those constraints with, new technology, new infrastructure, new consumer products.
Yeah.
We can just keep going. But in a footnote to this paper, he says, look, people, this is really just a theory. And the theory is only going to pertain if, I hope I don't mangle this quote, but he said, only if we can keep, quote, hacking arable land out of the wilderness at essentially constant cost. So that was so like land actually did come back in to this economic theory in a footnote, in this completely implausible stipulation that we can have continued economic growth as long as we keep extracting arable land out of the wilderness,
right,
at constant cost.
But that does leave out the whole reality. And I know you have a section on Our World in Data. You have some problems with how they present things, but not just Our World in Data, but tons of peer-reviewed work has shown that peak farmland has already been reached, that because of technological improvements and structural improvements in agriculture, you can get more from less land. And dematerialization is happening in every industry, which is why industry uses less water than it used to. Industry is the first to be more efficient about things because they want to save money, unless they're unconstrained about going to the ends of the earth to get the resources. So that there is a dematerialization that's happening.
Okay, so let's leave the dematerialization question to the side a bit and go back to this data point that we've reached peak productivity on agricultural land. So that would suggest that the amount of agricultural land that we're using should be declining, right? We should be able to turn agricultural land back over to the wilderness, or plant forests or some sort of carbon removal technology on that land. But this is not happening, actually. The amount of land that we're extracting from the wilderness for agriculture is actually increasing because the demand is increasing, and the demand in particular for meat products is increasing, and meat products uses much more land for fewer calories than plants.
Well, but this gets to the point you made about the word "we." I think, yes, like in Brazil, where I'm going next month for the first time in a long time to re-examine the Amazon situation I wrote a book about in 1990. There's a real problem. Although even in Brazil, you've seen changes, and it's mostly meat driven, as you're saying. So rather than talk about agriculture with a capital A, it's worth parsing out the parts that do fit as climate solutions, the parts that don't. And anyone who thinks, and you have a good section in the book on carbon capture through various means, planting your way out of this with carbon sucking trees is not going to happen, even though the IPCC has that gap that they chose to fill with such magical thinking. Just so we don't run out of time, I want to make sure we can sweep through some of the other points, and we can always revisit these.
I do want to say one thing about dematerialization, though.
Yeah, sure.
People have pointed to the rise of the internet as, evidence that we can dematerialize our economies. But of course now, because of AI and because of increased size of data centers, actually, Google is no longer carbon neutral, and we're planning to build. Data companies are asking energy companies to propose more methane gas and coal plants in order to power these data centers, which were supposed to be the things that helped us sort of, decouple the material reality of our planet from our economies and our production. And, it's to me a form of, I don't want to overspeak it, but it just seems completely unjustified to me. And you can only see that if you look at things in a systemic way. So anyway, I just want to.
I'm all about the systems approach. And I've just been tracking efforts to build Bitcoin mining operations in Ethiopia, which is so insane when you think of the gap, the average Ethiopian's energy gap. Speaking of the developing world, or China, of course, is a unique entity now. It liked to shield itself as a developing country under the climate talks for decades. But you have several different. Let's just get focused just to save time. And I don't know if you have another. Do you have another session right after we're done, or you?
I don't. Although I'm supposed to let the AC tech back in so that
you don't melt.
Melt.
I just don't want to waste too much time, but you make key points about China as a solution factory, and the U.S. and India, U.S. using India as a get out of free, and China as sort of a get out of free card.
Right.
And they're both important points.
Yeah. So there's a history of the behavior of the U.S. on the international climate negotiation scene in this book. And it's just not a very pretty story, even as Democratic presidents have presented themselves as the world's climate leaders. They've actually sort of collaborated with fossil fuel petrostates and India and China behind closed doors to make sure that there was never any kind of legally binding treaty enforcing climate regulations. And granted, that's because the Senate, of course, would never pass such a treaty. But there were other ways in which they undermined the UNFCCC regime. And what I'm arguing is that they should not be thought of as the world's climate leader. They should be thought of one of the bad actors in this space, and stop using India and China as cover for their own malfeasance. And in fact, weirdly, President Biden has said a couple of times, I've heard him say that the Inflation Reduction Act was the biggest climate policy in history. But newsflash, actually the biggest climate policy in history is China's 1+N climate policy, which is the most elaborate, all of government policy architecture you could possibly imagine, which tells them not only where they're going and what they want China to look like once they've phased out fossil fuels and established what they call an ecological civilization, but gives step-by-step plans that are verified by, they say, the officials of the Chinese Communist Party to get to targets year by year along the way. So what I argue in this book is that while we're congratulating ourselves for passing a policy that, guarantees less than 1% of GDP over 10 years, China is actually planning to peak emissions before 2030 and zero them out by 2060, having cornered the global market already on the production and distribution of clean energy technologies and things like EVs. And if we don't get off our proverbial tushies, it is going to be the Asian century, and it is going to be the authoritarian century, because for all that China does, it is an authoritarian, repressive nation. And I don't think America is going to want to live in an international regime that's dominated by China.
No, and this is percolating right now in the discourse around trade. The politics in the U.S. is about protectionism. Both sides are trying to raise the cost of Chinese clean energy technology here. And there's some pretty solid arguments. Jason Bordoff of Columbia University, who's substantially fossil-funded operation, has argued that's a big mistake, that we need to not be protectionist when it comes to these particular technologies. There's lots more in that chapter, and again, I hope people will dig in on the book. Innovation. In 2006, I had a page one story in the New York Times about declining basic research and energy, even as the U.S. was getting more focused on climate change and the world. Actually, it was a global trend, not just the U.S. They were all asleep at the wheel when it comes to innovation, but innovation has different fronts and different sectors, and you go hard at a certain sector here, of course, CCS, capturing carbon and putting it away somewhere. And I had a great conversation with Vaclav Smil up in Canada, one of the world's resource geniuses, who laid out the math for if you really wanted this to be a remotely significant part of the climate solution, you'd need something like 10 times the infrastructure we're now using to take oil and gas out of the ground,
right,
to get this stuff back. And who builds it and who pays for it? So you go at them hard. But let's just talk about the idea of innovation. Can you just sort of parse out, what's the bad and good side when you think of the word innovation as it relates to how you talk about it?
Well, I mean, I will confess that the chapter is not about the concept of innovation in the climate space, because, God knows we need innovation, right? We need zero emission steel. We need lab grown meat. We need, new forms of transportation that can take us from the East Coast of the United States to Europe without dumping carbon into the atmosphere. Like, we need a whole new system with new products and new processes. Like, I prefer the word creation to innovation, because innovation to me connotes kind of making capitalism more efficient, instead of like transforming things essentially. But I don't really get into that so much. And I don't, because all too often, really the vast majority of the time in climate discourse, innovation is actually code for either carbon capture, where a machine tries to capture carbon dioxide at the source where it's, produced through combustion, say, or carbon dioxide removal, which is a technology that attempts to suck carbon out of the air after it's been emitted. So I end up spending the entire chapter talking about the reality of these technologies and how the oil and gas industry are using them as their latest form of greenwashing in order not only to sort of sustain their license to operate, but also to sell the promise to policymakers that we can continue to use fossil fuels and just deal with the emissions, decarbonize oil, so to speak, with carbon dioxide removal. And they're getting, massive subsidies from the federal government, from both Republican and Democratic departments of energy. And they're getting massive grants from the Department of Clean Energy demonstrations for building, carbon dioxide removal plants that are going to remove like 15 minutes of annual global emissions. So,
yeah. And you quote from David Ho, who's an ocean scientist working on carbon dynamics in the ocean. Really interesting guy who I've been planning to have on the show, where he makes some important points about this. And he says the line for him is in delineating these technologies as a current day solution.
Right, exactly.
Is that something you think is important?
I mean,
Meaning,
I quote that because I thought it was so powerful, and I also think it's really important that he, as someone who's researching carbon dioxide removal and as an advocate for these technologies,
right,
is being very clear about their limits and is being very clear about how they're used for propaganda purposes, because all too
right,
many carbon dioxide researchers and advocates are essentially quite literally echoing fossil fuel propaganda and
right.
claiming that these technologies can decarbonize oil. So I wanted David in the book. We also went to college together, full
Oh,
disclosure.
that's cool.
So, but I wanted David in the book because he's such an important voice in this space, and I wanted to make sure to have that clear expression that he said that this is not a future solution, current solution, it's a future solution. My preference is not to think of it in temporal terms, in terms of what we're going to deploy now or what we're going to deploy later. I prefer to think of it as, is this a core solution, or is this something we're going to use on the margins, right?
Yeah, that's those
And
are both important.
I mean, they're both important. So to me, I feel like obviously we're going to need carbon dioxide removal to help with agricultural emissions, to help with construction emissions, to help with, like, the creation of medical plastics and other medical technologies. So the sort of the unavoidable emissions on the margins that are truly unavoidable, not just unavoidable because like rich people don't want to give up their private jets, right?
Right.
Truly unavoidable. But that's not what they're getting sold as. They're getting sold as technologies that could pull 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide out of the sky and restore
Right.
a pre-industrial climate, which is just, it's outrageous.
Yeah, and this is these are. I mean, to me, the main value of the book, and I hope people will buy it and read it,
Oh,
is to encourage getting clear about words. My watchwords mantra, even the title of this thing I do, sustain what,
right.
is intentional. It's, don't talk to me about sustainability. Sustain what, for whom,
Exactly.
how, and then you're actually talking, and then these other questions are revealed. Climate emergency. Who is in a state of emergency? Why? How? What are the remedies? The more we have this sort of practice of being clear, not just by the language we're using, but of course the language others are using, whether they're our antagonists or just our neighbors, is really a valuable way forward. Um, the last section is on resilience as another overused word, and it's definitely a word I haven't done a watch words thing on resilience yet, but it's one of those words that means whatever you want. It's used as a couch. It's used as um, an escape clause for actually being proactive about things. Disaster resilience is different than disaster risk reduction.
Right.
Disaster risk reduction is getting ahead of the problem,
Exactly.
whether it's an earthquake, sea level rise, etc. So just very quickly, what's your talking point, or literally, how do you want people to be thinking about this word when they see it or use it?
So there are a lot of problems with the word resilience, and it's one of the favorite words of the right wing. It's so easily appropriated, mostly because it implicitly suggests, silently but powerfully suggests, that our job is to shore up the systems we have now, to harden them, to make them more stable, to allow them to continue. And this is totally backwards. What we need is to dismantle the systems we have now and transform them into something that will allow us to increase our quality of life and simply to survive with a normal politics, a functioning economy that will, give a good quality of life to everyone on this planet, and, not a state of crisis and mass death over and over for the rest of the 21st century. We don't need resilience. We need transformation. So
Yeah.
that's a short answer about that chapter.
And when you see Rubio and DeSantis among those grasping onto the term, that says something.
Yeah, sure does.
And here's your line: from resilience to transformation. Now, the last thing I'll say about that, my wife worked for the last 6 years before she retired, teaching teachers how to teach sustainability concepts
Yeah.
or get them into their existing lesson plans.
Yeah.
And a big chunk of her her practices around systems thinking, and moving from systems thinking to systems doing is really hard. And transformation is one of those words that hangs in my head is so big,
Mm-hmm.
you know, kind of like, to me, climate emergency is not efficacious because it's fluff, it's vague and
Yeah.
loud. And transformation is different. It's like not primary colors. It's sort of like nice colors, but it's softly vague.
Well, this is why I completely agree with you, but this is why the last move I make in the book
Mm-hmm.
is to acknowledge that it's vague, it's overwhelming, it's way too big for any one of us. So ultimately, the goal is to transform yourself into someone who takes up the climate crisis, doesn't look away from it, and does everything they can to help get global heating to stop by phasing out coal, oil, and gas. And so the last moves of the book are to talk about the sort of like ways you can think, how you can help yourself with your emotions, like what you can do to transform yourself into someone who actually helps. Because I agree, as a concept for the world, it's just, it's not, you could write an entire encyclopedia about it, right? But at the end of a book that you've read and you've been with me in your head, I hope you will let me, offer you my hand and take you along on some of the ways that I've been able to transform myself into a climate activist, and how maybe you could come along with me.
That's good. And there was a comment. There was a pretty interesting comment that came in earlier. This is a good place to close things out. Whoops, that's not the one. Oh, here, talking about doing something seems bizarre. This person said, but
Yeah, it's like turtles all the way down,
so what would you say to someone like that?
Well, we're not talking about doing something. We're talking about how we represent the crisis, which is
Right.
just doing something. So I have a very sort of immediate and powerful sense that language in itself is a form of action, because you as a human being don't think without words. I mean, some mathematicians, scientists, visual artists think in images, but fundamentally our thoughts and even our emotions are mediated by language. Our thoughts are in language. And that language doesn't belong to us. It's actually a social thing that exists in the world, and that has political valence, right? It's created by history, it's created by social consensus, it's created by politics. So even the most private thoughts we have in our head are political. And the way that we think about things has political effects. The way we talk about them has political effects. Language creates thought, thought influences action, and action is what we need to take now if we're going to have a chance at a livable future.
Absolutely. You've reminded me of something to close things out. You may remember years ago, you were on this show with a friend of mine, Reggie
Yeah.
Harris. Let me see if I can play
Was
this.
that years ago? Good.
Yes.
You're
Lord.
weary, we all feel the pain. The actions of the world will try your soul again, but I know there's a better day, and it's coming our way. That's why we're raising our voices as we work today. We will not rest, oh, till the storm is over. Yeah, we will not lay this burden down. We will keep each other strong. We will love and carry on. We stand all together, solid ground. Storm is over, yeah, we will
I'm
not
getting to the end
lay.
here.
Keep each other strong. We will love and carry on till we stand all together on solid ground. Till we stand all together on solid ground.
No, yay.
So you remember that moment?
I do remember that moment. I got all teary. It was in the middle of the pandemic, and I was so lonely and scared. And it was just so wonderful to have this sort of like gospel moment with you all. So Thank you for reviving that. That was really
Yeah,
interesting.
and I think he in that song. I just saw him here in Maine just a couple of weeks ago.
Oh,
We got first
amazing.
first time we were together in years,
Oh, wow.
and he, he is a. It's a long path too. You do get at that in the book. This is not a quick fix.
Right.
There's urgency. Back in 2008, I wrote something about grappling with the idea of urgency and the idea of patience in the same
Yeah.
sentence, and it's really hard. But somehow or other, these conversations are vital. The book is a valuable sort of stepping stone and conversations toward climate progress, and understanding that it's a journey, and not leading to a new normal. That's
Right.
something that's on my list of watchwords. By the way, new normal.
Totally.
We're not. There's no outcome where we're just going to all sit back and relax. So thanks so much, Genevieve Guenther, for being here on Sustain What Again, and good luck with the book. Come back on. Maybe there's a lot more to talk about. So we just sort of did a rough sketch, and happy to reconnect with you too. And stay cool there. Sorry about the air conditioning
I'll
challenge.
be all right. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. It was great to be with you.
Great. And hold on just one second.